So this is specifically about stopping the Jewish National Fund in Canada. This is a focus on the Jewish National Fund in Canada. It's an international campaign to stop the JNF. And very specifically, this is a campaign not only to educate the Canadian public or the Canadian-based public as to just exactly what the JNF is and what it does and what it rots, but also to wage a campaign to get their charitable tax status in Canada revoked. That is really the focus and the purpose of the campaign, and to understand the connection between the Jewish National Fund and the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The JNF and stopping the JNF is very much a part of BDS, and that'll become clearer as this presentation proceeds. So we are myself, Naomi Sue Goldstein, and Zainab. And would you introduce yourself and let the folks know who you are and what you do?
Sure, I'm Zainab Amadahy, and I'm a writer, researcher, community activist. I do have a background in anti-apartheid organizing, both with South Africa and with Palestinian solidarity work. And I was one of the co-organizers of the original conference that took place at Boise in 2007, whenever it was. So that's me. Thank you.
I'm Sue Goldstein. I'm a member of the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, Women in Solidarity with Palestine, and the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid. You want me to speak up? Okay. Go ahead. No, I don't need a microphone. We can borrow this. We can share. Go ahead. Okay. Because I was trying not to go into the other room.
No, it's
So, and I've been active on this issue for a long time, in Toronto since 2000, and I think it's really important to talk about the Jewish National Fund as a critical part of the campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in detail later.
I'm Naomi and have been involved with Palestinian solidarity work for many years. I'm a member of the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and also Women in Solidarity with Palestine, which is based in Canada. We're going to do this presentation in the current political and economic and social climate that exists today. And very briefly, if we're going to talk about the Jewish National Fund, then we have to talk about the fund's role in what we're calling extractionism in this country. The Jewish National Fund is not simply something that emanates from Israel. The Jewish National Fund is very active in Canada in terms of support for fossil fuel research, for extraction, very much related to Indigenous struggles here that are focused on the environment and on saving the Mother Earth. The JNF presents itself as an environmental organization that's, quote, greening the desert in Palestine. And so if we're to stop the JNF in Canada, then we need to build a coalition of environmental groups and of pro-Palestinian groups, and all of those groups who are concerned with the extraction of fossil fuels, the tar sands, all of the environmental issues are directly related to the trade deals the Jewish National Fund has with the Canadian government, with the province of Manitoba, with the province of Alberta, and so on. So there are tremendous connections between the work of the JNF in Canada and the Canadian government's complicity and collaboration with the JNF in Canada in terms of the extraction of our resources, the resources here, and the relationship between that extractionism and Indigenous movements here in Canada. So it is an issue for us here, as well as an issue relating to Palestinian solidarity. The other thing is we want to make very clear is that this presentation is framed within the concept of building a movement. The movement to stop the JNF is not new. The research has been going on for years in this country and elsewhere in the world. It is an international movement and very much a part of work that's been going on in Canada for a number of years. But what we want to do now is take advantage of the political situation that exists here now, particularly in reference to the Canadian Revenue Agency's attack on so-called left-leaning charitable organizations. And so it's what we could call a conjunctural moment. It's a moment where there's things coming together that make this a very opportune time to go after the Jewish National Fund. And one of those, of course, is this whole thing around the Canada Revenue Agency going after really those organizations and those charitable organizations that have charitable tax status that are working in areas and in ways and making statements that run contrary to the conservative government's ideological approach to international affairs. So, that being said, I want to present what would have been a longer history, but I'm going to make it brief so that we all know what we're talking about when we talk about the Jewish National Fund. It has charitable tax status in Canada. It has charitable tax status in 50 countries around the world. So this means that it's considered a charity, but a military occupation cannot be a charity, and so we can start there. There's also a very strong case to be made that the JNF violates Canadian policy and law. Registered charities that operate abroad are supposed to follow domestic policy or lose their charitable tax status. And the CRA itself says that, quote, an organization is not charitable at law if its activities are contrary to Canadian public policy, which the Jewish National Fund is definitely contrary to Canadian public policy. I'll just name one way in which it's contrary, actually two. The first is that it is a discriminatory operation, completely discriminatory. It holds land for Jews only, and that is written into its charter. So that is a discriminatory policy which runs completely contrary to CRA policy and to Canadian law. And the other is that, according to the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, organizations that receive charitable tax status are supposed to spend no more than 10% of their time doing political lobbying or political work. And how the CRA and the Canadian government are able to separate the JNF from the politics of the State of Israel, I find it absolutely amazing that this has happened and that they maintain their charitable tax status in this country. Because it is absolutely clear, and there are numbers of examples that we can give, that the JNF does much more than 10%, spends much more than 10% of its time, its resources, and its funding on political lobbying. In fact, we could say that they spend all their time on political lobbying. So that's two ways in which they run contrary to Canadian law. We need to consider the JNF in the context of the settler colonial state that we live in here, the connection to realities here, in the context of Canadian/Israel deals in security and military support and collaborations. There's tremendous connection between the Canadian government and trade deals with Israel around security measures, around the military. The Ontario Provincial Police were sent to Israel a few years ago to be trained in crowd control and things like this. So the relationship is very tight and very telling. So this really is being presented in the sense that if we consider the savagery of the effects of dispossession today from Turtle Island to Palestine, we can see that it is a lens onto current practices of colonial racism and genocide, and that's the context in which we want to talk about the Jewish National Fund. So I'll begin with a quote from the Jewish National Fund director, Yosef Weitz, and this is something that he said on March 20th in 1941. Quote, the complete evacuation of the country from its other inhabitants and handing it over to the Jewish people is the answer. And he was speaking as the head of the Jewish National Fund in March of 1941. He was responsible for Plan Dalet, which was a campaign to ethnically cleanse more than 500 Palestinian villages and to expel their residents in 1947 and 1948. And then after 1948, Joseph Weitz organized the planting of hundreds of thousands of non-native trees west of Jerusalem to cover up the hundreds of villages that had been cleansed by Zionist militias. And so what this indicates is that JNF has always had a strong relationship with the Israeli military. Right from the inception, from 1901, at the time of the founding of the JNF and the establishment of the JNF, the connection and the collusion between the JNF as a land-grabbing operation for Jews only was very much in collusion with the Israeli military. The JNF considers itself, and this is in their mission statement, the JNF is the caretaker of the land of Israel on behalf of its owners, the Jewish people everywhere. So that means that all of us who are Jewish in this room are implicated in the operations of the JNF because they're holding this land for all us Jews everywhere in the world. And this is a JNF response to a petition that was filed with the Supreme Court of Israel in 2004. There were Israeli Jews who went to the Supreme Court of Israel to file this petition against the JNF, and this was the JNF's response to that petition. Quote, "The JNF is not the trustee of the general public in Israel. Its loyalty is given to the Jewish people in the diaspora and in the state of Israel. The JNF, in relation to being an owner of land, is not a public body that works for the benefit of all citizens of the state. The loyalty of the JNF is given to the Jewish people, and only to them is the JNF obligated. The JNF, as the owner of the JNF land, does not have a duty to practice equality towards all citizens of the state." This is absolutely, as you know, completely contrary to Canadian law. As we know, in Canada, it is illegal to restrict the sale of property to certain ethnic or religious groups. The truth is that JNF Canada officials are relatively open about the racist character of the JNF. She is keeping time on. They're relatively open about the racist character of the JNF. In May 2002, Mark Mendelson, who is the JNF Canada's executive director for Eastern Canada, explained that, quote, "We are trustees between world Jewry and the land of Israel." This was then echoed by JNF Canada's head Frank A. Wilson in 2009. Wilson stated that, quote, "The JNF are the caretakers of the land of Israel on behalf of its owners, who are the Jewish people everywhere in the world." So this is just to establish for all of us that the JNF is a racist, discriminatory organization that is the foundation for the land theft that occurs in Palestine. It presents itself as an environmental organization. It presents itself as an environmental organization intent on greening the deserts, while the pine trees it plants on top of raised Palestinian villages leach the groundwater, and Israeli factories on JNF-acquired land drain toxic waste and industrial pollutants down from occupying West Bank settlements into Palestinian villages. I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but any of you can go to the JNF website, the JNF Canada website, and see how they present themselves. And if they are not a political group of people, I don't know who is. Because they talk about how they are building forests and planting trees. They never mention the Palestinian people. They never mention the word Palestine or Palestinian. And they talk about the state of Israel as basically taking the whole region. Now, this is the goal. The goal is to take the whole region that we refer to as Palestine. It's very important to understand that what they are planting are pine trees. And you plant pine trees in the desert. When the pine needles fall, they leach the groundwater because there is groundwater in the desert. First of all, the desert in Palestine is a quasi-desert, a semi-desert. It's not what we would call a full desert. There is greenery growing. There are indigenous plants, indigenous trees, and so on. What is happening is that what the JNF is doing in terms of planting forests in the desert is that they're destroying the ground. They're destroying and leaching the groundwater. They're devastating the natural growth and the natural habitat of that growth, so that at this point, there is well under 10% of the original arboretum that made up the desert of Palestine. There's less than 10% of the original greenery left. It is now all wildlife. Van Lorber, who's done a lot of research on Palestine and the JNF, says that the state of Israel has attempted to bring the forests from Poland to the desert in Palestine, and that is what is going on. So that it's very important to understand the contradiction between the JNF presenting itself as an environmental organization greening the desert, when in fact what they're doing is destroying the natural habitat and the natural arboretum of that area. So yeah, it's forests and parks of recreational facilities have been strategically placed atop the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages. I guess I'm going to have to stop there. Oh, I have 2 minutes. I'm going to prioritize here. Okay, so let's just for a minute look at the Jewish National Fund and how it's comprised and why it controls so much of the land in Palestine. It was founded in 1901 at the 5th Zionist Congress in Switzerland. Its purpose was to concretize the colonization of Palestine by acquiring and controlling land for the exclusive use of Jews. It directly controls 13% of the land that has been seized from Palestinians, land that was transferred to the JNF after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, at which time the JNF colluded with the Israeli military to grab that land. And in addition, and I'll stop when I make this point, in addition, since 1953, the JNF has operated as a parastatal organization, which means that it appoints nearly half of the board of the government's Israel Land Authority. The Israel Land Authority holds the 13% that belongs to the JNF and an additional 80% of all the land in the Israeli state. So together, because the JNF appoints to the board of the Israeli Land Authority half of their board, together between the JNF and the ILF and the Israeli Land Authority, together they control 93% of the land in Palestine. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Hi. Take the mic. Okay. Got the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There you go.
So, just a little habit, I want to acknowledge that we're standing on occupied land. It's the land of the Mississauga New Credit Nation. It's also the land of the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat. So we were going to play a clip from a film, but I think we're going to, because we're rushed for time, we're going to pass on that. It's a film called Enduring Roots, Over 100 Years of Resistance to the Jewish National Fund. So Palestinians have been struggling against the JNF and Zionism for over 100 years. In recent times, more efforts have been made to expose and struggle against the JNF internationally, which has charitable status in over 50 countries, including Canada. In fact, the JNF began in 1901, as Naomi mentioned. They opened their first office in Vienna in 1902. They were incorporated in Canada in 1910 and in the US in 1926. And they continue to be actively involved in the theft of Palestinian land. So I'm going to hold up this postcard, which I'm going to have our lovely helper Diane pass out to you. This is a postcard to our very dear MP, Carolyn Finley, who's the Minister of National Revenue. We like to send her mail. We've sent her at least 1,000 of these from Ontario. So in the top picture, you'll see a bulldozer with a JNF KKL flag on it. The KKL is the Israeli name for the Jewish National Fund, Karen Kayemet LeIsrael, which literally means Perpetual Fund for Israel. And so this bulldozer is in the village of Al-Araqib, and on the bottom is the results of what the bulldozer does in one of the over 70 times that Al-Araqib, one of 35 unrecognized villages in the Negev, also known as the Negev in Hebrew, since 2010. In fact, it was first destroyed in 1948, and there was also a massacre that took place in Al-Araqib. doesn't get talked about much. The JNF is also implicated in land acquisition in both East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Now, according to its own policies, the JNF is not supposed to purchase lands beyond the so-called Green Line. However, Haaretz, the liberal daily, so-called liberal daily from Tel Aviv, in a 2005 investigation found that the JNF had set up a subsidiary company called the Himnuta in 1938. 99% of the company is owned by the JNF, and its offices are in the same building as the JNF. So it's effectively the JNF by another name. The Jewish National Fund also works with the Or movement as well as Elad. Elad is a settler movement working to take over East Jerusalem and push out the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem, and the Or movement is working in the Negev. They also work with another group called Nefesh B'Nefesh in a project called Blueprint Negev, and they also talk about going south. And Blueprint Negev is the Jewish National Fund's version of Manifest Destiny. And the target is Anglo-Jews, primarily from the United States, but also Canada, the UK, and Australia. And they like to bring 250,000 to 500,000 Jews to settle in the Negev. And this is fulfilling David Ben-Gurion's dream, because he's like, you know, in order to build the country, we have to go south. The Negev constitutes 66% of the land that Israel holds and controls. Unfortunately, it seems to be populated by other people, primarily Bedouins who are they're citizens of Israel, and yet they live in 35 unrecognized villages. And if Israel doesn't recognize the village, that means they don't have to provide any municipal services such as water, garbage removal, or electricity. So they're hoping to develop this, and one of the 12 points of Blueprint Negev states that improving the educational and economic opportunities for the Bedouin must be addressed. And how this is going to be addressed is they'd like to forcibly remove Bedouin from the lands that they actually live on and put them into what they call planned settlements or townships. And townships is actually a word they use. So for folks who have a problem seeing what the situation inside the state of Israel as well as in the West Bank and Gaza as apartheid, let's think again, because they're using the language of apartheid. Townships is a word that brings me back. As Naomi mentioned, the JNF likes to plant trees. They're known for plant a tree in Israel. And that's where I think that the Jewish National Fund and Zionism have a lot to do with settler colonialism here and in the United States. Because if you think back to how did national parks come about in both Canada and the US, and you see those lovely, I went to art school, I'll admit it, so those big, huge landscapes in the 19th century that show you these beautiful, you know, overviews, these beautiful landscapes empty of people. Well, there were people living there, and primarily they were indigenous people, but also, you know, in the US there was, you know, the homesteaders they sent out, they were also living there and eventually kicked off because they were like, they were placeholders for the building of the railroad and the eventual taking over and charting of the land and fencing it in. And it's the same thing with the JNF. The JNF has about well over 60 forests and national parks in Israel, and 48 of those parks cover the ruins of 89 Palestinian villages. Just out of interest, how many people here were really familiar with the JNF before you walked into the workshop? Okay. Well, are you familiar with Canada Park? Canada Park is built on the ruins of the Latrun villages, what they call the Latrun villages, the Latrun salient. It's near Jerusalem, and it kind of juts out, and the Green Line kind of went like this inside the state of Israel. And you know, they were really mad that they didn't get it in 48. So in 67, they took it over. And on the villages of Inwas, Yalo, part of the lands of the Beit Nuba, and Der Ayub, which is in the eastern section of the park. They built Canada Park. It was the idea of someone in Montreal whose name has escaped me for the moment, but they raised $15 million in tax-deductible funds in Canada for a park that was technically, I mean, okay, we're going to drop 48 for a moment. Let's just play the settlement game. This was in the West Bank, so it was illegal under international law, and yet in 2007 they continued to raise funds in Canada for the upkeep of the park, and most recently, as last fall, there was a fundraiser on Queen Street at the Tattoo Parlor to raise money for a path in Canada Park, a wildflower and biking and hiking path in honor of those Israeli occupation soldiers who've been held in captivity. Oh, no comment. So there have been campaigns, as mentioned, that have gone on for a number of years in Canada against the Jewish National Fund.
How many minutes do I have left?
All right, I've got about 7 minutes, because we want to make sure.
You got 7 minutes?
Okay. I'm going to start in Scotland. Bill Clinton spoke there at a Glasgow GNF fundraiser in 2001, and since then there have been counter-demonstrations with every single public appearance of the JNF, hundreds turning up at the Hilton Hotel galas and dozens showing up at golf tournaments at isolated courses. In fact, the Scottish Palestine Solidarity campaign has been key in really building the Stop the JNF campaign in the UK. In 2003, San Francisco-based Jews for a Free Palestine protested in front of the Jewish Community Federation where the JNF is housed. It was part of a larger campaign to renounce Aliyah. There was a 3-year period where there was a focus on confronting the JNF's continued confiscation of Palestinian land. I'm just going to mention a couple of instances locally in Toronto and Canada. In 2005, Alauda Toronto launched a petition asking Revenue Canada to revoke the JNF's charitable status as part of its campaign against the JNF. And in 2007, Ron Saba in Montreal filed a complaint with the CRA regarding the charitable status of the JNF because it violates Canadian Customs and Revenue Agency's standards. And in 2007, at the JNF's annual Negev Gala in Toronto, over 200 people representing 13 organizations showed up at the Sheraton Hotel on Queen Street to protest. And this was the gala that was a fundraiser to refurbish Canada Park, now known as Ion Canada Park. In 2010, the Palestinian National Boycott Committee issued a call for a comprehensive boycott of the JNF by international civil society and any governments that actually uphold international law. The JNF is a perpetrator of ethnic cleansing, and without the JNF, there is no Israel. They are a key part of that. So they fit the profile of a primary target for the BDS campaign. So the campaign was launched in 2011, sorry, on Land Day, which is March 30th. And it's had some significant successes and, relaunches, and we're hoping to continue to build it. And just one last thing is we're organizing a delegation in the spring of 2015 to go to Palestine. It's a Stop the JNF delegation with the US and Canada, and we hope that some people will be interested in going. You'll meet people, Palestinians whose lives are directly affected by the JNF, and you'll meet with people from Zochrot, Adala, and other organizations actively working against the Jewish National Fund. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Sue. I actually was invited here by these two co-panelists to talk about actually some of my work. And it's going to feel like a little bit of a digression. It feels like it to me, but they wanted me to talk about some specific writings and research that I've done, which has to do with the intersections of Indigenous knowledge, emerging hard science, and social justice work because it has implications for community building, alliance making, and solidarity work, which they impressed upon me was so important around the JNF and some of the other work around Palestinian solidarity and BDS and so on. So I'm going to do a really fast run through and focus on some science. I do have a science background, medical technology and photovoltaic technology. I'm not going to do any editorializing about the implications for social justice work, but I'm sure you all can fill that in. So I'm sorry this is going to feel like a bit of a jump, but time is what it is. Okay, so in terms of my two more recent publications that I have, and in terms of the thesis and the argument that I have to make in my writings, I'm going to start talking about the impact of stress on us very quickly, because I think most people understand and know that when we are in a state of stress, our bodies produce a lot of adrenaline and cortisol, which is great for the fight or flight, place that we have to be in when we're actually in threat or in fear of our lives. But it's not so good over the long term to be in fight or flight and to have these chemicals in our body for a long time. It's called chronic stress, and chronic stress, the effects of it on our health are lowered immunity, slower healing processes, accelerated aging. Specific diseases now have been linked to stress, like cancer, stroke, high blood pressure, and so on. Blood and oxygen supplies to the higher thinking centers are reduced, which impairs memory, creativity, learning, and so on. Blood and oxygen level supplies to the... anyways, the whole thing, being in a state of stress, which is great if you need your, like if you need to run or flee or whatever, or fight, actually promotes feelings of distrust. Some of the biochemicals that go into our system, that our body puts into our bloodstream, creates feelings of distrust, suspicion, disconnection, difference. We get really contracted when we're in this state. We're less open to new information, less likely to be listening to folks. And what some scientists have said is that it promotes a tribal mentality. So, depending on how you identify and what groups you identify with, if ethnicity is important to you, religion or nationality, for example, you're much more prone to kind of get into a them and us kind of dynamic, right? When you're in a state of stress and even when you're in a state of chronic stress, that is ongoing stress. So momentarily, to be in a state like that is fine. It's really healthy. That, these, the kinds of, a stress reaction, our bodies are equipped to react to stress. It's part of our well-being. It's part of our ability to stay safe. But again, doing it for over a prolonged period leads to chronic stress and all these health problems. And I just want to say as well that, some of these feelings that we carry with us, anger, fear, jealousy, competition, like all of these kinds of, normal reactions we have to our world. Again, they create the stress reaction. So if we're kind of walking in fear or we're walking with anger over a long period of time, we are damaging our physical and mental capacities. More recently, this has been known for a long time, more recently scientists have started looking at the impact of pleasant emotions, or what I'm learning to call prosocial emotions, on the body and the mind. So emotions or state of mind like love, compassion, caring, sharing, cooperation, gratitude, gifting, these kinds of things, promote positive well-being. They have all these indicators of really good, they correlate with indicators of good health, physical and mental, and we can measure this as well in the lab. So some of the biochemicals that get into our bloodstream are things like DHEA, oxytocin, nitrous oxide, and other hormones that are really kind of more expansive types of hormones. So, and what happens on a physical level and the mental level, it heightens immunity, accelerates healing, improves memory, enhances learning, enhances creativity, promotes feelings of connection and bonding, creates a sense of openness and trust, generates resiliency. So that means that you're less likely to be triggered into a state of stress, and if you are triggered into a state of stress, resiliency means that you can bounce back a lot easier and quicker. I promise I'll make the connections as I'm going on here. Okay. So studies show that you can be the initiator of some of these positive, emotions or positive activities. You can be the recipient of them, but even witnessing them. And there are many studies about witnessing, kindness, and gifting, and all this kind of stuff. It'll still impact you in a positive way and give you all these positive benefits, physically and mentally. And even just listening to a person, just what you do for a person when you just listen really actively or really deeply is you calm down their amygdala, which is the fear center. So you actually calm down their fears, and again, they start to benefit from the sense of openness and the sense of trust that can happen between folks. There's spiraling in both directions. So if you continue to cultivate feelings in either direction, you actually can, heighten the process for yourself. You can also structurally reshape your body, and structurally reshape your brain. The brain part is really new information, but you can, through cultivating pro-social emotions and pro-social activities, you actually change the way your brain looks, not just functions, but looks. So the blood supply, blood vessels form, there's more neurogenesis in the areas that are responsible for these emotions. That is to say that there's more cellular growth, there's more connection between the cells, there's more communication between the cells of your brain. So the other thing I want to talk about now is, now I've talked about these individual things that happen to us on an individual level, is to talk about interconnection and relationship. And the one example that I'm going to have time to talk about here, I hope, is electromagnetism, the EM field that we all give off and is measurable as well. I think at this point we can measure it up to 8 feet outside of the body. Each of us produces one. There are other life forms on the planet that also produce EM. The planet itself produces EM. And the EM keeps going, but we can only measure it, I guess, up until about 8 feet outside the body. And this EM field actually contains information. We know that now, like most energy does. It contains information, and what we're giving off is actually information that we're sharing with the world. We're sharing with other life forms, and we're sharing with each other. And so that information is basically part of that information is what we're feeling and what we're thinking in any given moment, right? And so it can change very quickly. But again, if we're carrying a particular temperament or particular state of mind for a long time, that's probably the majority of what we're sharing with the rest of the world. And our bodies react to each other's EM. And again, this is provable and measurable in the laboratory. So if you would just want to consider 2 people and not, everything, but just in terms of 2 people, you can have, EM fields syncing up between 2 people. You can have one person's EM field, their heart EM field, actually showing up in the EM field of another person's brain. The same vibrational patterns will show up. And our bodies react to that, even if we're not aware of it. These biochemical things that I was talking about, the changes in our brain and so forth and so on, we may not be aware of them, but those changes actually happen and are measurable in the lab, in lab settings, and in life settings. And what we have found, people, a lot of this research comes from the Institute of Heart Math, and so they were wondering for a long time, because sometimes what would happen is the EM fields would just sync up somewhere between the 2 people, between the vibrations of the 2 people they were looking at in these experiments, and then other times one person would kind of dominate the electromagnetic vibrations of the other person. And what they have now found is that the more balanced and grounded you are, the more likely you are to impact others. So from my point of view, again, I'm of Indigenous background, so a lot of the terminology and the reference I use will be, that'll be the place that those are where my teachings come from, and so those are the things that I sort of look at when I'm looking at this research and trying to interpret it. I'm coming out of that worldview. So for me, it's kind of like looking at someone who has cultivated that inner spirit of peacefulness and calmness, being able to actually impact and have more influence over other people, not to manipulate them, but just to, as I say, was talking about, just sort of calm people down and get people to feel a little more open and a little less under siege, a little less contracted. Okay. There's no faking it, by the way, so you can't say one thing and feel another and think that you're going to have that energy come out in your electromagnetic field. It really is a matter of being sincere and authentic and cultivating a particular mindset, a particular heart way of communicating in the world that will actually at least create openings and create a sense of safety and openness and trust, so that people can sometimes, at least listen to us. Okay. So I'm really generalizing a lot here. It's a lot more complex than I want than the impression I'm giving you. But that's the situation with time and all of that. But my conclusions have been, with the work that I've done, is that cultivating your own spiritual well-being and cultivating good relationships, because I don't think you can do one without the other. So cultivating good relationships in the world has implications for your activism and your community building work. Material and physical interactions in the world also matter, of course. So, no matter how compassionate or generous and trusting you feel towards, other people, people still need nutrition, people still need intellectual stimulation, housing, social interaction, those basic needs, those basic human physical needs. But again, in my teachings, which didn't include all of this like hard kind of science, because we have a form of native science, if you will, but we've always acknowledged that those things were just as important to us as food is. So the idea of cultivating kindness, compassion, cooperating with each other, and so on are just as important as what we do on a day-to-day basis. So movement building, allyship, solidarity, all of these stuff is not only politically useful, but again promotes our physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being. And as I said, I believe and I feel I make a strong case for the fact that spiritual development, however you want to define it, is about relationship. It's about right relationship in the world, as my elders would tell me. So thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much to my co-panelists for sharing the time with me.
Thank you very much, Zainab. I just, before we get to the Q&A, I just want to point out this book, which Zainab has written. It is called Wielding the Force, The Science of Social Justice. And this book actually was a real eye-opener for me. It's a wake-up call, and it's a quick read. It's very plain language, very clearly stated, and it's an excellent book to read if you're a social activist, if you're thinking of becoming a social activist, and if you want to get involved in the Stop the JNF campaign. Everything that Zainab has just told us is related to how we have to work together in the movement and in our social and political work. So I really recommend that you get a copy of this book, read it. I'll just read one very quick thing.
Available at Base Attune.
Yes, they're available at Base Attune. And it says, warning, this book may cause an outbreak of healthy, sustainable communities. And that is a fact. So I highly recommend the book. We're going to now take questions, if there are any questions or comments. Are there any questions? Yes.
Sue.
respects the person who gives it to you as probably having good intentions, but rejects the actual action of the
I'd like to respond to that with a story, a true story that is from Dr. Ismail Zaid in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Dr. Zaid is from, is it Beit Nuba, which is one of the 3 Palestinian villages that was destroyed and demolished for the building of Canada Park. And he has been trying for years to get the JNF divested of its charitable tax status. And he's written umpteen letters to the CRA and to politicians. And in speaking of trees, their response was to plant a tree in Canada Park in his name. So I'm not sure that, and I'm speaking from my own point of view, that there is a way to do what you suggested, that this is one of the problems with the JNF and with getting the CRA to take seriously the fact that they are violating CRA legislation as well as Canadian law. And that is that their charitable tax status has to be revoked, and there is no way to respect the planting of those trees. What's needed is a respectful educational campaign, not a campaign that will validate that donor or validate the planting of those pine trees, but that will respect, but in a respectful way will call for the revocation of that charitable tax status.
Can I just, in answer to your question, I would check out the Fallen Donors page, because it kind of addresses that. And it's found that a lot of people in Jewish communities, some people know what they're doing when they donate to the JNF, but a lot of people still don't know. So, you can get some information. There are, a good place to go would be Rabbis for Human Rights or Dukium for people who are still, innocently giving to the JNF. Although there's been a lot of, the JNF's been in the press a lot because right-wing Zionists and even some liberal Zionists have been taking the JNF to task, like for transparency about what they're doing with their money in Israel, and they're thinking about the relationship between the Israeli government and the JNF, which is interesting because the JNF does what the Israeli government officially and yet unofficially cannot do, which is actively discriminate against people seen as non-Jewish, in particular Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as the refugees. So,
okay, yes, gentlemen.
I'm just wondering if there has been any kind of open or genuine response from, or discourse from the CRA, and what that response, if any, has been when faced with these kinds of challenges, to legality, to someone who's discriminating and acting against Canadian law and acting against.
Well, the response to Dr. Ismail Zaid's request was to plant a tree in his name in what had been his village that was demolished by the JNF.
That was done by the CRA?
No.
Oh, no. The CRA response, I'm sorry, the CRA did respond. I'm aware that at one point the CRA responded and said, that there are certain circumstances under, and this was in response to a letter written by a man named Ron Saba from Montreal. The response was that they were interested in what he had to say. Basically, he was saying the JNF practice is discriminatory, is discriminatory and racist. And the response from the CRA was that there are circumstances under which these kinds of things that it can happen, but it's okay under certain circumstances. And so that was the official response. The CRA has never acknowledged the problem. And it really is clear that if you want to, it's like an Alice in Wonderland kind of situation, because somehow or other, the JNF has been able to remove itself as the foundation for the theft of the land in the State of Israel, but also to remove itself in a way from the State of Israel itself. And so the CRA has never acknowledged the problem. And that's what this newly revitalized campaign is meant to do. Other questions? Yes.
And isn't it kind of self-defeating to plant pine trees?
Yeah.
Indeed it is,
But I
because
don't understand why, I mean, just from an environmental point of view.
they serve two purposes. The first purpose, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, I don't need to, never mind, I think of that. The first purpose was to cover up the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian villages. The other purpose was to create a kind of a Europeanized village in Palestine. I was in Central Europe last summer, and I met someone who said, yeah, I went to Israel and I felt like I was in Europe. And there really is this sense that, Israel wanted to join the European Union, and they seem to forget where they're located. So, and also, pine cones spread the seas, and pine trees are evergreen, so they need a lot of water. They've also planted eucalyptus trees, but at the same time, it's interesting to note that Israel has uprooted over 800,000 trees since 1967 alone. We're talking about indigenous trees like carob, lemon, orange, and olive trees. And some of the uprooted olive trees, some of which are 1,000 years old, were planted in Tel Aviv and other places and sold on the market. And Palestinians living in smaller agricultural villages depend on olive trees and their lands to support themselves. It's a different way of life. And it's kind of this struggle between an indigenous way of thinking, as Zainab was talking about, and a way of relating, and this European idea of fencing off and enclosing the land. So it's about enclosure as well, and land theft.
Just to add to that, if you read Max Blumenthal's book, Colonialism,
Yeah.
there's a chapter where he talks about in recent years there was a huge forest fire, partly due to global warming. The pine trees are really, really poorly in their semi-desert environment. There's a huge forest fire. The other thing he ties into this as a very brilliant journalist is that Israel, a country that spends up to 10% of its GNP on military every year, didn't have the infrastructure to deal with the fire. They went and they were helped by the Palestinians to put out the forest fire of these pine trees that they had planted to suppress their destruction of Palestinian villages.
Yeah.
Quite a story.
Thanks for that. Yeah. I just want to just make this point, and that is that most of the land now owned by the JNF was conquered during the Nakba, during the time of the establishment of the State of Israel, and it ended up in the hands of the Israeli Land Authority. The other thing is that during and following the Nakba, Israel created facts on the ground as Palestinian lands were taken over by what was called the custodian of absentee property. And so the JNF had acquired 70% of its land through confiscations from Palestinian refugees who were expelled or who left in 48, and present absentees. They were called present absentees because they were present and absent at the same time. Their property was present, but they themselves had left. And so these were, I mean, you think about Alice in Wonderland, I can't think of anything more apt than the notion of being a present absentee. So those lands were taken, and that the JNF had acquired 70% of its land through confiscation at the time of the Nakba. Any other points or questions?
Nina has her hand up.
I have a question for Zainab, but I also have a comment about Nichols. Can I make my point?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, in case you didn't hear me say this at lunch, I work with a project called Narrow Bridge, which is a chandlery, a candle making place in Northern California. Jonah, Eileen, Daniel makes thousands of Hanukkah candles every year and sends all of the, by hand, hand-dipped beeswax candles, and sends all of the profits to the Stop the JNF fund. So I have a list of the candles available with their prices and a sheet that I'll just pass around in case you didn't have a chance to sign up yet. And you can also talk to me about any questions you have about the campaign. And they all get delivered here to my house, and then we connect and we bring you the money and take your candles.
How long does it take?
Well, we put the order in just before the end of November, so they're in time for Hanukkah. But there's also Shabbos candles and Yortzeit candles and Havdalah candles available. My question for you, Zainab, is around trees and magnetic fields. I was just, as you were talking, I saw Ellen Gabriel speak this summer at the Conquest in Montreal, and she was talking about Oka and how the warriors would stand with their backs to the trees in order to get power from them. And this was, you know, a protest. Well, how can we summarize all that? Anyway, you can hear in the mainstream media that it wasn't just that the pines were going to be taken down, it's that the pines had spirit, and that the pines were there to, it wasn't just an ancestral burial ground, it was a living spirit place for, you know, Mohawk people and everyone needs that space. So something she said very specifically was that they would stand with their backs to the trees to get power to do their social justice work. And I was just wondering if you had explored tree energy.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of left that out, I mean, of the presentation, but it's definitely in the book. The whole idea of trees have very powerful electromagnetic fields, water as well, you know, absorbs and gives EM, all of the plant life, all of the animal life, and they have an incredible, they probably affect us more than we affect them. We can affect them, but they are, no question about it, a source of healing that, again, is quite measurable in the lab. That's probably all I'm going to say at this point because of the time limitations. Yeah.
Yes, back there.
I'm Daniel Tower, I'm in Winnipeg. We started doing some work on the JNF there. Friends were suggesting this years ago, and it took us quite a while to get started on it because the JNF is such a mainstream organization, and I think a lot of people see it as not political. I mean, my comment about the campaign to remove its tax status, I think when Coalition against Israeli apartheid was first founded, they talked about boycott, investment, sanctions as economic action for the sake of education and education for the sake of economic action. The reason I bring that up is because actually some of my friends are sort of into, you know, working on this from a legal perspective, but it's like, that's not going to happen. Like the Canada Revenue just looking at the technicalities and going, oh yes, these guys don't qualify, and just pulling the tax stats. I want to just talk about you creative. I was in Canada Park when I was in that land recently. Another thing about the JNF is it's quite difficult to sort out what actually they do. Because I mean, your presentation is great, although there were some sort of blurrings even in that between what's Israel and what's the JNF. For example, military occupation is not charity. I mean, that's not really the JNF, although of course they're involved. There's a lecture on Leah Cheryshavsky's Video News Network by Badi Al-Ghazi. But if you watch it, it's extremely dense. If you watch it, I'd recommend sort of making notes and pausing it now and again. In terms of creative projects, so I connected with Zochrot, and they founded the new JNF and created a fictional character, so we did the same in Winnipeg. Although I think we were hoping to build on that next year, because most of the people going into the gala didn't know we were out there probably, although William did come by. It was
a good performance.
Thank you. I played the role of Klepti Landau, who eventually realized he was not going to steal people's land after the JNF and founding the new JNF Canada. There's also, you know what, it took me a bit of searching, I think, but I stumbled on a video of Max Blumenthal and others went to a JNF dinner with trees. With trees.
Tree saplings.
Palestinian villages demolished in '48. And it was people, I don't know what people, I mean, we had a nice visual, somebody showed up on a tractor, but people thought they were part of the JNF debate, and so that sort of provided them an inroad to talk to people. Anyway, I don't have a clear answer to this. We should coordinate our efforts.
Thank you. I just want to comment that I think that really, and I'm just saying this from my own perspective, but going to the site, the JNF website, the political connection between the JNF and the State of Israel and what the State of Israel wrought in Palestine is very clear in the JNF website in terms of the visuals that they use and how they describe what they're about. So I think it's really important for all of you interested to check out that website.
Sure, but saying the JNF is the State of Israel is the JNF. Like, I don't know if that's what you're saying.
No, that's not. What I'm saying is that the political nature of the JNF is very clear from its own website, is what I'm saying. And yes, we have a question. Would you like to ask a question?
I was just comment about the energy of the tree. So you were saying that whatever emotion we carry, we somehow spread and convey that magnetic field. So I'm just wondering, trees planted for that reason might have a different kind of energetic level.
That's true. I mean, I can't say definitely because I don't know that anybody's researched it, but because we are all connected at that, what I would call a level of spirit, we are influencing each other all the time. And I wonder about planting trees in landscapes in parts of the earth where they actually, let's say, take more life force than offer, and I wonder what the impact of that is.
I'm sorry, but did you have a question?
Oh, it was a follow-up question. I guess I was wondering, because I was you were saying that you felt that this campaign, especially, the campaign believes that like stopping JNF's funding would sort of stop.
They're revoking their charitable tax status.
Right, but also stopping the JNF in general.
Oh yes, stopping the JNF. Yes.
Yeah.
There's no reforming it.
Yes, it's not to be reformed.
Would be, because this is what you're trying to, when we say the JNF is like taking down the JNF and taking down the, maybe that was more.
No, I don't think we're saying that. It's part of the BDS.
No, but we can dream.
We can dream. Yeah. I also just want to comment that I think one of the problems with the JNF and this campaign that has been launched and relaunched and built and rebuilt, that one of the problems is the way the JNF has either been able or in collusion with the State of Israel has managed to present itself as somehow separate from the actions of the State of Israel or from the political realities and the social realities, that the JNF stands alone as a charitable organization, and that's the problem. Yeah. Diane.
I just have a question. They gave Stephen Harper a bird sanctuary, right?
In the Hula Valley.
Is he the first non-Jew to be given that honor?
No.
Okay.
There's a road going through Canada Park named after John Diefenbaker. And if you're in Canada Park and there's a big array, a big wall, and it has the names of all the donors. They're not all Jewish. So if you know any people who are not Jewish who gave or have had trees planted for them, they can go to the Fallen Donors website. There's also the Stop the JNF has a website, www.stopthejnf.org, and Independent Jewish Voices Canada, ijvcanada.org, also has pages dedicated to their campaign to expose and stop the JNF. And Zainab, do you have a website as well?
Yes, it's swallowsongs.com.
Swallowsongs.com.
And where can we get your books?
Base Attune, and if you go to my website, it'll tell you where the books are available. I have 2 with me.
And also just to point out to people, because we have run out of time, on November 23rd this year, the Jewish National Fund will be holding their annual Negev Gala at the Toronto Convention Center. Please save the date. We have flyers. We will be there, and we're inviting everyone to join us. More information will be coming. It'll go out online, and there will also be these flyers everywhere you go. And that's November 23rd.
And if anybody wants more information or would like to get involved with the campaign, come see us and we'll sign you up. But I also have evaluation forms, which are
hang on,
lovely.
there's one more point that Diane's just made that's important. On Friday evening, November the 7th, at Palestine House in Mississauga, which you can find out how to get there online. The film that we were unable to show today will be shown.
That was a different film.
Is that the same film?
No. The film that's going to be shown on November 7th at Palestine House also will have its Canadian premiere at the Toronto Palestine Film Festival. It's called The Village Under the Forest. It's about the South Africa forest. And the village that's buried beneath it, and it's a really good film, and it's worth seeing. If you can't make it out to Palestine House, you can get in touch with Stop the JNF Canada. It's canada@stopthejnf.org.
Yeah,
I'm remembering
it is .org, yes.
Because I have a copy of the film. So now back to the evaluation sheets, which our handy friend Diane will pass out to you with pens. It's an evaluation sheet about the conference, and they tasked me with passing it out to you. Thank you.